Hello. Today we're picking up our discussion of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks with the chapter 5 on the lived experience of the black man. There are several important things going on here, and one of the objectives of this video in particular will be to flesh out some of the philosophical background that Fanon is working with here. Particularly, there is the dichotomy between the one and the other that is at play. So I think this is really developed in Beauvoir. You see it particularly in The Second Sex, and she outlines it in the introduction there. The other thing is that Fanon carries on a pretty detailed discussion of Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, which is an important 1945 text that outlines you might call it the etiology of hate. It provides us with like a scheme for understanding anti-Semitism, and it is also connected to their analysis of bad faith. So you have the one and the other. You have the comparison between anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-black racism, as well as the relationship of bad faith that's at play there. So you'll notice early in this chapter when Fanon talks about how other people in society comport themselves. Remember, it's significant existentially that we appear as an object to others and that others reflect us back to ourselves, that we are sort of presented with an image of ourselves by the other that we encounter. Now notice early on he uses the term other with a capital O. He says, in 20th century, the black man on his home territory is oblivious to the moment when his inferiority is determined by the other. Naturally, we have had the opportunity to discuss the black problems with friends and less often with African Americans. Together we proclaim loud and clear the equality of man in the world. In the Antilles, there is also that minor tension between the cliques of white Creoles, mulattoes, and blacks, but we were content to intellectualize these differences. And then we were given the occasion to confront the white gaze, and an unusual weight descended on us. The real world robbed of us our share. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in elaborating his body schema. The image of one's body is solely negating. It's an image in the third person. So there Fanon is using this idea of the other as the other with whom I discuss, and then shifts a little bit into understanding of how the black person is made an other to themselves, or they're able to feel alienated from their surroundings because of the way they're othered by the people who encounter them. So what is this distinction between the one and the other that's kind of underlying? I think it will help us to understand what Fanon is doing here. So the idea of the one is the legitimate person. The one is the person who's taken seriously, the person who gets to set the terms of the debate, the person who's seen as having legitimate projects and ends. Their existence isn't like questioned. You want to go do something, go into a bank, open up a bank account, cool. People are there, happy to help you. What can I do for you? So on and so forth. Their projects in the world are legitimized by the other people that they encounter. And they have social power and standing, and they're recognized in their personhood. So that's the one. Now the other is always defined merely in relation to the one. So the value of the other is determined by this relation. They play a subservient role. And the other is really supposed to have a support function in relation to the one. They are the one who's asking, how may I help you? They're the one who's legitimizing, who's getting out of the way for the one so that they can do their thing. The one gets to be the sort of protagonist of the story, whereas the other is always relegated to a support role, and therefore the other is always subjugated to the one. It's always playing sort of second fiddle, in a sense. So that's what we're seeing happening here, where as Fanon says again, an unusual weight descended on us. The real world robbed us of our share. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in elaborating his body schema. So this is the idea of uncertainty, that it's difficult to legitimize yourself in your own projects. If you're drawn into question, how can you legitimize yourself in the face of a white person who ultimately gets the say-so, whose word is counted, and who's taken at their word, if you have to, come to a disagreement or anything like that. A good example of this is in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Ellison has a passage where he talks about being on the street where you could be caught at any moment and asked to justify yourself, to show your papers or something like that. But no matter what you said, it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be taken as being legitimate or seriously. And so there's always this uncertainty, there's always this question in the back of the black man's mind, as Fanon explains it, that he won't be able to justify himself, and that it's other people that are determining his existence. A lot of the first part of this chapter is dealt with the look. Look, a Negro. It was a passing sting. I attempted a smile. And the more that this gets reiterated over onto the next page, he says, I couldn't take it any longer. I already knew there were legend stories, history, and especially the historicity that Jaspers had taught me. As a result, the body schema, attacked in several places, collapsed, giving way to an epidermal racial schema. So to become reduced to the mere outward appearance that is determined in part by other people's, white people's reaction to you, scared of you, questioning you, repulsed by you in certain ways. So this always, again, sort of destabilizes the experience of the black man that as Fanon is recounting it here. It's always like in a position of second guessing yourself, or something that you have to sort of push back against. Now, when he starts to talk about Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, Fanon sees some similarities here and some differences. So the way that the Jewish person is subject to this kind of racial discrimination is similar. So the Jew is also rendered into a position of the other, expected to be subservient and so on. But the Jew has one advantage that from Fanon's position, and that is that they could pass the physiological characteristics that white supremacists and anti-Semites use to identify Jewish people are kind of questionable in Fanon's eyes. They don't always track reality quite exactly. Anti-Semites are obsessed with trying to discover some ancestral marker that would pick out the Jewish person from among the population. This is something that Frege's logic has the idea of this ancestral mark that carries like the counting from number 1 to number 2 to number 3 and so on. That they carry with them this sort of ancestral mark. In his notebooks, his sort of famously anti-Semitic notebooks, Frege applies this same idea of a conceptual marker to human beings, that we needed to discover a way that we could pick out by this ancestral mark the Jew that was passed on from one person to the other. So again, a racialized sort of biological notion of race that's passed on sort of genetically, and Fanon picks up on this same idea. For Fanon, though, see, that's a problem within anti-Semites are trying to like figure out how can we pick out a person's Jewishness. For black people, and the black man in particular that Fanon is discussing here, it's on the surface. There's no passing if you have a darker complexion. If your skin is darker, you wear that sort of outwardly, and it is immediately obvious to people that you're non-white. So that's something that the ability to pass differentiates anti-black racism from anti-Semitism, although they share other certain structures. Now, of course, there are Jewish people who more proudly wear the displays of their religion and ethnic group, but the ability to sort of take those things away in a certain sense. Fanon at least sees that as being somewhat different, but he draws pretty heavily on the text. On page 95 is where Fanon says that the Jewishness of the Jew can go unnoticed. He is not integrally what he is in terms of that physiological outward appearance, again, which is always kind of questionable, and anti-Semites sort of fuss and worry about how can we pick out the Jew, whereas again, for the black person, it's on the surface, it's their skin, it just differentiates them, their skin tone, complexion. And he acknowledges the persecution of the Jews, of course. This is not like I don't think it's wise to interpret this kind of argument as being like who has it better or worse kind of thing. It's not like an oppression Olympics. It's merely trying to like outline the structural differences and how these differences play upon the body as it presents in social and public spaces and reflects the person back to them, right? Because this is about the lived experience. The inability to sort of hide from racial categorization takes a certain toll and plays a certain role in the experience of the black man as Fanon presents it to us here, and also structures the racial prejudice against them in a particular way, having no recourse from it. He talks about being fixed. Now, again, if we think about existentialism broadly, we know that people are not fixed according to existentialism. You are the being that you're not, and you're not what you are. Always ahead of yourself, transcending the present into the future, rooted into the past, spread out over this time in this diasporic way. So to be fixed is to be reduced essentially already to an object, to be made and objectified in a way. Again, just reduced to those things that are picked out by the skin, which already objectifies. It already ignores the inner life being for itself, the project's goals, thoughts, beliefs, all that kind of stuff. Now, Fanon also begins to bring up this idea of being sort of mythologized, and so part of the racial makeup of the black person from the eyes, from the position or from the perspective of an anti-black racist, is this association with cannibalism and brutality, to be brute, to be a brute, an animal, a beast. So that also comes up in here. Another way, a further way in which the black man is othered in this instance, with this association with cannibalism, that is always sort of haunting the person who manifests as black in the world, right? And that's something that ends up getting associated with their genetic makeup, and so it's something that can't be, you come from the cannibal. There's always this latent cannibalness in the genetic code, just like sex is codified in the genes and so on. A reduction of a person to their mere biological function. And then, of course, it's just to think that there's some sort of cannibal gene. That's just bad biology. Forget any sort of biological reductionism. Put that aside for a second. That's just to think that something like that is already just sort of faulty biology in a way. But I think, too, Fanon would resist any kind of biological reductionism. I mean, if you're taking existentialism seriously, you cannot think that people are totally determined genetically, that there might be physiological features and things like that that are determined genetically, but that a person's entire sort of behavioral makeup and the way that they think about the world is determined by a biology. That's just not something that existentialism is going to support or anything like that. So certainly Fanon is is resistant to any kind of that, to any kind of interpretation that would suggest that. Here again, you get this is from, again, the position of an anti-black racism. Negroes are savages, morons, illiterates, but I knew personally that in my case these assertions were wrong. There was this myth of the Negro that had to be destroyed at all costs. We were no longer living in an age when people marveled at a black priest. We had doctors and teachers and statesmen, okay, but there was always something unusual about them. So again, this is the double bind that is placed upon people who are othered and marginalized. And the same thing, there's parallels here again with what Sartre is saying in Anti-Semite and Jew, that it's acknowledged in a sense that a black person can do all these things. They can be doctors and lawyers and statesmen and so on. But there's something like not quite right about that. There's something like already transgressive in the other taking up a role of responsibility and prestige and esteem in the world. There's something like fishy about it from the perspective of an anti-black racism, okay? So again, that not quite fitting or always feeling like question, like you have to do, one of the things that we see a lot talked about today that I think Fanon is really striking out at here is that you always have to do extra work to justify yourself. You have to be better, more articulate and profound and more successful and more, all of your I's dotted and T's crossed to an extent that, a white person in that role never has to be. So there's this added impetus to have to like justify yourself. White people, particularly white men, don't have to justify themselves as much. It's taken sort of for granted that they are legitimate in their position, whereas because they're thrown into question, the black person or the woman or whatever the case may be, if the person has been othered and marginalized in this way, then they must justify and legitimize their occupying this position. They can't just be granted that they deserve it or that they accept it. This is another point of comparison that Fanon brings up with Sartre's analysis in Anti-Semite and Jew, where there's this desire to show that you are not like the myth that is being told, the myth of the Negro, as Fanon puts it here. The black person is struggling to show that they aren't like that myth does not actually explain and capture their person. And this really happens almost any time we create a conceptual umbrella term that would capture a group of people in their totality. Again, there's a tension between sociological descriptions and theoretical descriptions of people and groups of people, which will always flatten out particularities that exist between individuals versus any given individual in their lived particularity, that with their particular history and so on and so forth. There's always going to be that tension there. And existentialism is particularly interested in this tension between the need for a structural analysis that will speak to kinds and groups and patterns of behavior and so on, while at the same time recognizing the sort of inalienable importance of the individual and their lived concrete particularity. So Fanon's analysis is really striking out at that and highlighting and developing that with regard to the experience of the black person, the tension that is generated within their experience between the idea and the myth of them, their cannibal nature that is marked by their black skin and so on and so forth, versus the reality of like how they live their life in the particular, and that with all of their, again, hopes, dreams, desires, plans and projects and so on. And concrete projects like they're a lawyer or a doctor or a priest or whatever the case may be. And the tension between the idea that people have of them and their actual function and activity and behavior within that role, whatever it may be. So this is we see a tension today with this in something like identity politics, where identity markers become very important, race, class, sexual orientation, gender, all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a kind of a tendency when that goes a little bit too far to allow that to become like a totalizing feature that all gay people are such a way, all black people such a way, white people all such a way, so on, so on, so on. And again, there's a use for that kind of analysis on the structural level when we're talking broadly about classes and kinds and so on like that. But then we have to be careful when we move to the level of individual analysis, because we can see the kind of havoc that those generalizations that those kind of generalizations bring to the experience of, for instance, the black man. And it's particularly pernicious when you are disempowered. It's a less significant for the white person because there's less at stake for them, because generally the society is structured to not question them and to allow them to sort of go about their business, to allow me to walk around a store and I'm not followed by police or security guards and that kind of thing. I'm not suspicious. I can walk into a suburban cul-de-sac and, you know, people are like, oh, he belongs there. Whereas if you're othered and marginalized in society writ large, your presence there is questionable. People think you're up to something, you shouldn't be there, you're followed more suspiciously, your experience becomes more antagonistic because people are questioning you and demanding that you justify, like, why are you here? You don't belong here. What are you doing? What's in your pocket? What's, whatever the case may be, right? So the stakes are higher for people who are structurally marginalized and othered than they are for people who are able to claim the status as the one, who aren't questioned as much. So again, generalizations sure can be harmful to white people. Their feelings can be dismissed on the basis of their whiteness or masculinity or something like that, but it doesn't seem to be as pernicious, because as just a matter of course throughout the day, it's unusual for that to happen. When they're in a debate with someone as an intellectual exercise, their privileges might be drawn into question in a certain way, and that can sting somewhat. There can be hurt feelings and that kind of thing there, but they're going to go about their day, and it's not really much to write home about. Whereas it can be deeply and profoundly disruptive. It can lead to violence it can lead to heavy policing and violence and incarceration, lost opportunities, all kinds of things in the instance of the person who's structurally marginalized by the kind of makeup of society in a way, right? And that the experience of that kind of marginalization is what Fanon is interested here. And again, there's a lot of good analyses of and comparison between the work that Sartre does in Anti-Semite and Jew and the lived experience of black people in this particular chapter. So that's good there. I think this essay, this video, I think can stop there on that point. The other portion of this chapter that I think is significant, I'd like to revisit a little bit, is the poetry, César's poetry, which I think is really important. And here again you can see Fanon sort of confronting and adapting the negritude movement. César is again an important poet and philosopher of negritude, which we discussed in the very first video of this series. So I think that deserves a treatment sort of on its own. So we'll sort of split this chapter up. I'll leave off here with these discussion of the one and the other, and also the comparison to Judaism and Anti-Semitism, where Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew is the major touchstone there. And I'll pick up with this analysis of César's poetry in another video. So thanks for following along, and I will see you in the next video.